And before we start, let's have a quick poll. Is there any of you who are interviewers in this room? Can you use like some reactions for us? Any interviewers? Oh, we got one, Alexander. We only have one interviewers in the room. All right, and the other questions, how many of you are currently looking for jobs? Can you also give us some reaction? Oh, we got one. Cool. Looks like, yeah, a few of you are looking for jobs. Yeah, Bharat, you can approach them later during networking time. All right, let's get started. Yeah, thank you for participating. And today our topic is under the hood of architecture interviews at Indeed. And we are glad to invite Bharat to join us as a speaker. And here is our schedule. We'll do a quick introduction, and then another like around 30 minutes, we'll do a presentation by Bharat, and we'll have Q&A time. Afterwards, we can do networking. And first, let me introduce WebHack Meetup a little bit. So we are a monthly tech meetup based in Tokyo, and we've been doing this meetup for over 3 years, almost 4 years. And today is our number 51 event. And what we are doing is we invite speakers from different backgrounds and come to our meetup to give tech talk every month. And since pandemic, we started moving our meetup online, and we even started our YouTube channel. So if you haven't subscribed to our channel, you can search WebHack Meetup in the YouTube. And we will post all the recording of our meetup online. So far, we have more than 1,500 members joining our meetup, and we have more than 2,000 attendances. And the reason why we can keep hosting this meetup since pandemic is because we have great communities, and many speakers keep coming back to us, give a talk. So if you want to be part of us and you want to share some cool technical topics on the stage, yeah, feel free to fill in this form. And great, can you help me to put the link in the chat? Thanks. Cool. And yeah, let me quickly introduce today's speaker. And Bharat is a staff software engineer in Indeed, and he's been working in Indeed for 5 years and conduct a lot of interviews and even train some people to do the interviews. So today he's gonna share the topic under the hood of architecture interviews at Indeed. Without further ado, Bharat, please take it away.
Hi, right, let me share my screen. And please let me know if it's visible. All right. Can you see my screen? Cool. All right. So thanks for the introduction, Piper. This is a presentation on the architecture interviews and what goes behind the scenes for them at Indeed. So I just start with a quick introduction of myself. Who am I speaking on this topic here? Like Piper mentioned, I've been in this industry as a software engineer for about six and a half years, and I've spent five of them at Indeed. So a lot of time here, and I started with one startup before that, so there wasn't a lot of interviewing experience there, but I've collected some considerable interviewing experience at Indeed. I've conducted various rounds, whiteboards, architectures, and university recruitments, etc. And I've also organized sessions across geographical sites within Indeed so that all of the people can reach a consensus on the conduction of interviews as well as the evaluation criteria, etc. So this is just a little bit about my experience so far. However, I do want to point out that this is not going to be a presentation by Indeed. It is simply my personal account on having been through this process and having been involved in this task of interviewing, etc. This is my personal learnings, some philosophies that I've seen followed at Indeed, and I wanted to share with you some of its implications and just my personal learnings and account of how they go. All right, so before I go into either the perspective of the candidate within an architecture interview or the interviewer, what I want to begin with is a little bit about the interviewing philosophy that's followed at Indeed. I think it ties a little bit into what are the learnings that can be derived for the interviewer or for the candidate. So I just wanted to briefly touch up on this. I do not have first-hand experience in how other companies do this. I only have second-hand experience by talking to different people who are in those companies and organizations. So I cannot really speak to the fact if this is a common philosophy, but these are some that Indeed follow. So the first bit that is widespreadly and very well communicated at Indeed is that candidate experience is the top priority. So it may seem less relevant in terms of what is the goal of an interview to evaluate whether a candidate is a fit or not. But this is something that's heavily focused, and I've seen it heavily focused in presentations and calibration sessions where people are told. And this is because the idea behind this philosophy is that we want the candidates to best represent themselves in that interview session. There's only a limited time that people have during that session, whereas actual work, our work around architecture, designing systems, or even solving algorithmic problems takes much longer than 60 minutes or 40 minutes. But then we expect candidates to perform well and do well in that time and convince the interviewers that they're a good fit. So what we really want to make sure is that the interviewer also allows the candidates to best represent themselves. So which includes providing all the necessary directions to the candidates in order for them to succeed. So what does this actually do? It's possible that during the interview, in keeping this a priority, it's possible to say that there weren't enough signals that we could collect out of the candidate. You can always go back and take another interview, for instance, but there is no resolution of the fact that something went bad in an interview. So it's really treated as a top priority. At best, say if everything goes well, it's a good experience for everyone involved. The candidate is able to represent themselves in the best manner, and the interviewer is able to collect all the evaluation criteria that they have, and they're able to reach a decision. At worst, say if that does not come about, then it's at least a learning experience for the candidate and people have a good time overall, rather than, I don't know, giving somebody a bad day about an interview. So that's one. But on the flip side, what this does lead to is there's a fine line between making a candidate or helping a candidate successful to success and giving away the solution. So this does require good training for interviewers who are willing to get involved in this process, take interviews. This is the responsibility of the organization, that given that this is a priority, it's well communicated. What is it that is just giving away the solution, and what does it take to help a candidate? So an example that's conducted here in Indeed and that I think is valuable for this particular point is when, say, a trainer is leading an interview and there's interviewers who are shadowing the interview, trying to learn the experience. The first point of agenda between the discussion in the discussion that happens right after the interview is letting the shadow speak if they found there were points of improvement that the lead can make in conducting that interview. Even though we're talking about somebody who's led 100 plus interviews at this point, and they're looking to train other people in that process, it's still the first priority is given to the shadow to tell the trainer if they were maybe confusing at one point or if they were too helping at another point. And it really helps people continuing to improve in what they do. So this is just one of the philosophy that's followed indeed. The other is just really conducting objective interviews. You may have heard of this in other sessions related to just interviewing and such kind of interviews at Indeed, but this is also heavily focused. So what does this actually involve? Conducting objective interviews? What it means is defining beforehand a very specific criteria on what exactly is to be the method of evaluation of a candidate, and then communicating that exactly as well as widely as much as it can be done through either training sessions or such seminars or the setting up the process of shadows and reverse shadows, etc. But then communicating it very finely to everybody in the organization who's going to be conducting interviews. So what does this do? I think it leads to very important bits. One is it leads to consistent experience for all candidates. So no matter a candidate is appearing today for an interview or the next year, or say during the holidays, all of them would be evaluated in the same manner and all of their experiences should be consistent. The experience should not depend on what site they're interviewing for, what geographical location, what team they're going to be interviewing for. And this sort of keeps all of that culture looking the same way. And it does not cause rift within the same organization between teams, between sub-organizations, etc. And the second point I think I wanted to mention, just consistent evaluation across all geographical sites. So you would not have things where where the standards can vary between different locations within the same company. And I think that's an important bit. So given that that is how things are conducted, we did ask before how many interviewers do we have here amongst us and how many people are looking for jobs or just approaching this presentation from the perspective of candidates. I saw that there were a lot more candidates than interviewers. So I will go over the learnings that I had as interviewers for this architecture round, but I'll not spend a lot of time and I'll go to the candidate section, which follows right after, and spend more time over there. But I just thought that I'd begin with this section on what learnings have I derived so far from conducting these interviews, from conducting these sessions, and from the philosophy that I just described. So the first bit is a little generic. It is not specific to architecture interviews, but this is also heavily focused at Indeed, and I think it's valuable here. So this is something that I learned. So it is important, I believe, that we master interviews one thing at a time in this manner. So interviewing overall is very open-ended. You have to make a very important decision on something that's going to affect another person's job. So I think that it has high responsibility attached to it, this decision of evaluating another person and a fit. So it's very open-ended. There's a lot of signals that you can collect. There's a lot of ways in which questions can be phrased, a lot of ways in which interviews can be conducted, etc. So it's fairly complicated, needless to say. And it is complicated enough where if we do not have to worry about changing factors, there's at least something that we can put away from our mind. So changing factors may include different types of interviews or different ways of asking a question to the candidate. So if somebody is interviewing, I think what they want to do is just repeat the same thing that they did the first time, the next time that they do it, and the next time, till they perfect it. So if you've started taking algorithmic interviews, for example, but then it's entirely possible, this is something that I've heard and I've felt it myself, that after a while you can find that it can be less and less exciting, say, to ask a whiteboard question, find out if the candidate is going to answer in one way or another, etc. And then people want to then take different rounds of interviews or switch up how they're asking the question. But then my recommendation is against this, where if you can focus on one thing at a time, just one interview type, one way of asking question, and you repeat it overall, it makes it so that the interviewer then just knows their round in and out. And there are fewer to no surprises. So if you phrase a question and the candidate comes up with a response, and this is something that you've not heard posed as a response before, then that's a genuine surprise, and that's good. And that is something that you should have a mental capacity for, rather than changing up the way in which you're asking questions, changing up the kind of rounds that you've been taking, in which you are new as well in that experience, and the candidate is new as well. And that can just be a little suboptimal, I think. This is, again, feel free to disagree and talk about this here, but this is what I have noticed. And so when the next time I go into an interview, I have practiced the statement so many times that I can just get that out of the way, and I can focus on really important things, like how do I evaluate the answers that the candidate comes up with, rather than fumbling with my words at the description of the problem, or finding out how do I lead this interview from one aspect of the problem to another. So that is something that you can keep in mind. There's a note here though, and just like anything, this has a flip side as well. So even though you would have mastered that round, that way of leading the interview, we must keep in mind that it would still be a first time for the candidate. So expecting them to ace it every single time just because we know what the answer to that problem is not ideal. I know I do not need to say this. This is something common, but I just thought that I would throw in there this note. All right, so second bit, I think I have one more after that, after which I can pause for questions. So the second learning that I felt existed for interviewers, and this is specific to the architecture interview, at least in the description of this learning, is that there should be a fixed criteria to evaluate a candidate on. So I touched up on this in the philosophy that we have even within Indeed. There needs to be a thought that's given, a good amount of thought that needs to be given on the criteria that's required for evaluating a candidate. So I remember that as part of my startup that I had worked with before Indeed, I was tasked with taking an interview for some candidate, and I had no idea what I was doing. So I did not know what exactly. So I started with finding a question, figuring out all possible answers for it, and then finding out what would be the satisfactory answer that I'd look for and say yes to a candidate who comes up, which is a lot of task, a lot of work. And what we want to do, if we want to be successful and be responsible at this process, is finding what is the exact evaluation criteria. We do not want to ask a problem, get a response, and then figure out if it was satisfactory or not. We should ideally have everything pre-figured out before we go into the interview as interviewers. So there should be a top level question that you're looking to answer. So which for architecture interviews can look something like this. So what we want to find out in this interview is how well the candidate would perform designing systems in your team. So you know what work you do in your team. What you're really evaluating is if this candidate was also on your team designing systems, how well would they be at when they perform the same functions as you do, as people on your team do. So if just this simple criteria or this simple question keeps a lot of things in perspective during the conduction of the interview, because you can always go back to, hey, the question that I'm asking right now, would it help me answer this that I want to have an answer to by the end of time in this interview? So I think this is important. And also just a little more and not just this one question. So it's important to not have an exact solution though as part of your criteria of evaluation, because in our trade, every solution has trade-offs. In architecture, whether one system goes here or another system is better here, there's no real correct answer. And so in deciding a evaluation criteria for an architecture interview, for a question within an architecture interview, I do not think that it should be very specific to the technologies used or the shape of the solution, and that should be defined within the criteria. I don't think that is a good way to go about it. There's always going to be things that have good performance versus bad performance in the options that the candidate mentions, and it is important that we stay open to that as interviewers. So things have trade-offs. Solutions should not exactly be part of the evaluation criteria, but it should be something broader than that. And evaluation criteria as example is just here, where you may want to figure out or understand how is the ability of this candidate to understand the problem, any relevant requirements or constraints that it poses, offer an architecture that solves the problem with good justification and alternatives considered, and then find solutions to problems that can arise henceforth. So after that solution has been established, after that system has been designed, there's of course going to be problems that arise, and you can always pose them as counter questions or just extensions in some sense to the problem itself. And you want to be able to see how well do they perform on those questions and on those fronts. So at the end, no matter how vague we are getting by stating that there's going to be trade-offs and there should not be a correct solution per se within your evaluation criteria, you still want to have a final solution on paper. So I'm not saying rule that out, but what that solution looks like need not be exactly the same as what you've come up with in a criteria. And you also want to focus on what is the process that the candidate followed to reach that solution. If they simply hand it out to you in the first 5 minutes, that is not what we're looking for, what you're looking for as an interviewer. What you want is if there's a justification. Because see, at the end of the day, what we want to find out is how well the candidate would do at designing systems in your work, in your company, in your team. So just solving the problem that you've posed that day isn't the objective of that interview. The objective of that interview is to be able to extrapolate behaviors and indicators from this interview time so that you can answer this question, really. And an optional criteria could be about knowing what to communicate. I think this is not very ambiguous, but in the interest of time, I think I'll go forward. And if I have any questions for this, I can explain this then. All right. And the last bit, which I think also borrows a little bit from the philosophy, and I think this is an important bit for interviewers, is you, at the end of the day, I think, or I feel that interviewers are responsible for helping the candidate succeed. So we want to be able to highlight the strengths of the candidate. Like I said, people have good days, bad days, and they can be well in one particular. So if they do not have the necessary skills in one area, as an example, there's little use in asking more questions about it. I've faced similar experiences as a candidate before, where there's something that I do not know about, say, a system or a part of a system. But then if that's an important bit, even if it's an important bit, if the interview is just in that one area of the system for, say, 20 minutes, then there isn't a whole lot that I can add, given that I do not have the skills in that area. So what I'd really be wanting to talk about is another thing that I excel at. And like I said, since this is such a vast area, architecture, there's going to be a lot of areas. Some people can have a good amount of experience and good skills in setting up databases, for instance. Some can be really nice and have a lot of experience in front-end technologies. So different candidates look different in shape as to what their strengths are. And it is the responsibility of the interviewer to make sure that that strength is showcased. So perhaps they're knowledgeable about something else that's relevant within your system. After as interviewers, you understand that this is not the strength of that candidate, move on to another area. Try to figure out if they can excel at that area and they can showcase their strengths over there. I think that's very important. There's going to be hints just like any other interview. So hints to keeping conversation useful and ensure that no time is wasted. For example, if the candidate is good in an area and you've now evaluated that they have those skills in this one particular area, then there is no real need for you to be convinced more on that same point, right? So in the interest of time, move to another topic, figure out what is more that you would want to know in order to answer that one question. How well would this candidate be designing systems on your team? And there's, of course, no reason to be rude or cause something that spills into the next interview. Oftentimes, we take, as candidates go through an entire loop in a day. So they go from one interview to another. You do not want to be the cause of anxiety or just a bad mood going into the next interview, and you want to give them the best chance at just the interview loop. So these were the three that I had for interviewers. Are there any confusions or questions here that I can explain better before I move on to learnings that I have for candidates?
I have a question. You mentioned something about keeping the interviews kind of like in the same format, if I understood correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And how about like questions? So my worry about keeping like an interview in the same format is like if I ask the same questions, those questions might be leaked, and then someone can find them on the internet and be like prepared in advance. So how would you deal with that?
So that's true. And so at any point you want to be talking about a lot of different questions, sure. I understand that's a legitimate concern. I think that a lot of architectural systems can have different questions, but that are essentially talking about the same thing. Solution-wise, there's ways in which we can find out similar questions like that. And here, question is a very specific thing. Even if, say, you're unable to fix a question because of that concern, there's other aspects of the interview itself that you can fix so that you can at least draw these large level categories of that interview itself. So you can be like, okay, an interview's solution or an interview's session would have requirements gathering as an example in the beginning. So even if that is not happening automatically, say for one particular candidate, you can make it happen. You can say, hey, how about we begin with requirements gathering here? So you do not have to juggle around. By the end of the interview, you're wondering whether there was any requirements gathering that happened or not. You do not have to worry about that because you know if you're at this point in the interview, it would have happened. So it could simply be this bit, or if you're talking, since this was generic, if you're taking whiteboard interviews, you continue taking whiteboard interviews over and over till you perfect, okay, this is how a good whiteboard interview would be. It need not be the same question, but there can still be such themes that are extracted overall from a type of an interview. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Cool. So I think I can move on to the bits about candidates here. So just some learnings that I found could be valuable to share if you're approaching an architecture interview from the perspective of a candidate. This is something that I do not find elsewhere, but I think that this is a valuable thing to say. So as candidates, you want to think about the architecture interview as an equivalent for a design review in your work. I'm sure a lot of companies do this, have a review for a design that's required, that's going to change a wide system, etc. Some companies have this as a huge thing where there's a lot of presentations that happen external and internal about a design that's going to be implemented. Some do it within their team itself, but I think this is at least a majority. Let me know if that's not the case. But what you want to do is also treat interview in that similar fashion. So just like how you would lead a design in your work, you may want to lead the interview. So given that you are now responsible for designing the system that the question has presented to you, you want to take that up. You want to say, okay, so first you can feel free to structure your time in that interview, just like how you would tackle an actual design problem. So you can say, I want to spend the first some minutes in collecting requirements, making sure I have scoped this out well. And then I want to give you a large overview of how this design is going to look like. And then there's always going to be points where the interviewer can suggest things. You can definitely take that into consideration because at the end of the day, that is the aspect that separates it from the design review and the interview, where it's possible that the interviewer is interested in talking about some specific bits. So then you can move on to those specific bits. But you should have a plan structure on your own before the interview, before going into the interview, on how exactly would you deal with such problems. So you can draw inferences from what you do at work when you're designing problems. Think about it, write it down, or whatever is somebody's preferred way of dealing with this. But then you should come up with a structure on how exactly you're going to divide that time. What it also helps candidates with is figuring out where they are in that interview time-wise. So if you think that a lot of time has gone by and you've not clearly explicitly stated out the details or even the overview of that design, and say you're 30 minutes into the interview, you can be mindful of that only if you've thought about what's the sort of structure that I'm going to add to this interview. So 30 minutes in, you can see that this has not gone anywhere. If you think so, then you can take a step back and say, hey, let me cover this bit, because I think I just want to tell you this is how it's going to look like from above. This is the overview of the system. So you can lay that out and then you can move on to other things. But candidates may find it difficult to keep time also in perspective, because anyways, it's little time, 40 to 45 minutes to come up with the design if this hasn't happened before. So I think this is one thing that I would recommend. Another is product requirements are really important because they help you in defining the problem. So anything really that changes your solution or changes your answer should be an important aspect of the problem. And product requirement is one such thing. So if you scope a problem out in one way, it can add different systems to your diagram, for instance. If the scope of the problem is to handle really large scale, then there's going to be new components that are added to your system. If it's not to handle a large scale, if it's something that's new, that's coming up, and you want to decide whether or not you'll scale it up after it's taken some time running, then those will not be the components that you'll focus on initially. So this is just keeping scale in mind, but there's going to be other requirements that may or may not lead to certain certain aspects within your solution. So this is very important. In my personal experience, I've seen candidates excel at it. I've seen some candidates ignoring product requirements as well. And I think that it is a valuable aspect to cover when you're approaching these interviews from the perspective of candidates. I think it's an important piece to start with in that interview. Another is that technical depth helps. Just overview it is not enough. I have been faulty of this when I have given interviews as a candidate, and I have appeared for interviews where in preparing for it, I would read a lot of technical designs that have that other companies have written blogs about, or even here that I've read about. And what that does not give me is some depth in this particular. Hold on, let me turn off my VPN. I think I may be causing some delay. All right, sorry about that. So, right, what that does not give me, these reading designs, is some technical depth in components or the aspects of that system design, which on the other hand, my work does. So while I'm working on systems, while I'm working on components, I work closely on some aspects of the design because I either implement it, I debug it, or I scale it up, I add things to it, I change things. That gives me some particular technical knowledge, and I think that helps. When, as candidates, you approach a problem, you're able to design an overview system that would handle the problem, but then you're also able to discuss in depth certain nuances of one or two, if not more, components within that system. Things like database, cache, or load balancers, or just how the front-end interaction would look like, API design. There's going to be a lot of aspects that a candidate can cover as something that they have some depth in. And I think that shows, and that's an important thing to showcase within an interview. Simply suggesting that this is how the large level diagram would look like, and we can add and remove systems as and when we change requirements or change scale or have certain other things come up, is good, but I think this is even better. So something that may work in theory may require checks and balances in practice, which I'm sure all of you would have seen while working on different systems. The documentation says something, but then when you're working on a system, you're debugging something, it's broken because of another reason. Such learnings are important to showcase, I think. So draw from experiences on projects. If you think you've not had good amount of experience on one particular thing, build a sample system. Try working on it, seeing, load test it, figure out how even building a load testing system, for example, is a good exercise if you want to just find out more in depth about a component that you'd be discussing in one of those interviews. So I think that's also something that we should focus on, just not reading designs isn't the only thing here. And the last bit that I have here for candidates is there's no real right answer, like we've touched upon before. So this is something that has implications for both interviewers and candidates. From interviewers, this means that the evaluation criteria should not have an exact answer as the right answer. For candidates, what it means is something that you're suggesting may fit the solution, but it need not be the best, or it's possible that there's it is the best, but it is not immediately clear why that is so. So justification and reasoning is very important. When you make a choice within an architecture interview, I think it's really important. It's more important than making that choice to justify and reason it out very well. So you want to state out explicitly why that's a good fit in this particular case, rather than simply suggesting, hey, this is a technology that would work wonders in the solution. Instead, this is why it would be. There's almost always an alternative. So contrasting and comparing is even better. It displays that you have technical breadth about such systems, and you can then also justify the choice that you're making. Do remember, though, to stay relevant to the problem at hand, because it's easy in talking about a lot of these systems and their general use cases and their general trade-offs to just go with something that sounds better on paper, but within this exact problem, it may not excel. So these are some of the things that I thought from an architecture interview standpoint, candidates should focus on. Are there any things that I've maybe not explained well, or any questions that are here? The next slide is actually just the summary, so go on, sorry.
Oh, we got one question in the chat. Is the evaluation criteria same for all candidates, or do your expectation vary based on the candidate's previous experience?
Right, so I can speak about this. What my personal experience has only been with Indeed, so I cannot really speak about other companies here, but within Indeed, the focus is on keeping a single evaluation criteria for all candidates to ensure that consistency that I talked about. Previous experience or not, the only responsibility of an interviewer within one particular interview is to determine how well this candidate is a fit for this particular interview style. If they have less amount of experience, but they're really good at architecture systems, and they can design a really good one given the requirements, then I don't see that as a drawback or as something that should be taken into account. So a single evaluation criteria for this particular interview round is what I would suggest. Also, like I said, there's way too many things to think about. So as much as you can focus things and narrow it down without taking into account the experience or the field, etc., that the candidate has worked in before, if it can simply be about answering this one question, which was how well the candidate would perform designing systems, that's all there is to know. And that's all the interviewer is responsible for.
So even if the level they're applying is different, would the expectation also be different, or will still be the same across different level?
So the expectation on clearing this interview would be the same. The way that works for different levels is some of the candidates for different roles would not have such an interview, would have such an interview. So there's other ways in which that can be accounted for, but that does not have to change the evaluation criteria of one particular interview itself.
I see. Thanks. Yeah, I think you answered Nina's questions. Probably can continue for the summary.
Right. So this is just to summarize the learnings from both interviewers' perspective and candidates. There's not content beyond this, just a one-slider thing to recap. So as interviewers, we just want to focus on mastering one thing at a time. We do not want to complicate things more than they have to. We want to formulate an exact criteria of evaluation without that criteria containing an exact solution though. And we want as interviewers to help the candidates succeed and represent themselves the best. And as candidates approaching the architecture interview, we want to lead the interview as we would lead a design review. We want to clearly collect requirements and let that influence the design we come up with. We want to be able to demonstrate technical depth and not just an overview and a breadth. And we want to, very importantly, justify well the choices that we make within our solution.
Yeah, thank you so much for your insightful presentation. I guess no matter from interviewers' perspective or from candidates' perspective, like we do learn a lot from your insights. And I think now it's time we can take some questions. Anyone want to jump to the stage directly? Anyone? If no, I'm gonna ask a lot of questions. All right, I can start first. So I'm wondering, like, during calibration, probably there's, I'm wondering what's the most common, like, good points or bad points being brought up during the calibration. Is it okay? You can like share these kind of things. Probably it's also a good learning experience for all of us.
Could you explain your question maybe with an example, if you?
For example, like during designs, during architecture interview, probably one candidate spending too much time on like certain part or like doing something which consider as a no good point or no good sign, and which will affect the result, things like that.
Right. I think the way I have seen architecture interviews conducted, that's usually not the case. So like I said, since there's such a heavy focus on making sure the candidates are successful, it is considered the interviewer's responsibility to lead the candidate to another aspect of the design if, say, they're spending a lot of time in a particular area. So the evaluation criteria does not contain time spent as an example here.
Right.
So I would consider in this particular example, the responsibility lies with the interviewer. We want to be able to help the candidates. If you understand as an interviewer that the candidate is spending a lot of time here, move them to the next segment of the interview and make sure they cover that as well as the first point.
I see. Understood. And actually, my questions were like, for example, if there's like some common mistakes many candidates make during like your hundreds of architectural interviews?
So I think some of these learnings that I had from the perspective were as a result of that already, because like I said, even I see requirements gathering as an important part of a lot of design review processes. When I've seen design review processes in different places, or I've talked to friends who are at different organizations conducting design reviews and leading designs, we all know that requirements gathering is an important aspect. We want to be able to question the product manager on what exactly are the needs of the system before we dive into creating a solution for it, right? But somehow there's candidates still that miss this segment initially. When the problem is, this has parallels in whiteboard interviews as well, for example, where somebody can start writing code to a problem without first understanding what the problem is meant to do, or conferring with that interviewer that they understood that in that manner, right? So there can be people who do not collect requirements here similarly, when I think that is an important aspect of just a design in general. So that's one. Justifying choices. Yeah, I think all of these are just really things from what I saw during the interviews.
I see. Understood. Thank you for the answer. We also got some questions from our audience. One of them asking what to do if you find that all candidates do not fit the job requirement.
So what we're saying here is you want to be able to evaluate them well. So is the question really that you're done evaluating and you understand that they're not a good fit? Is that the question?
Well, basically, yes, like suppose that you are about to begin an interview, you got some lists of candidates from your HR, right? And you have kind of a barrier, what kind of people are coming in, right? Mm-hmm. And then you find that, for example, all people who come in, they are lower than your barrier. Right? Like for all your questions, you find that the answers are not acceptable and you don't want to work with these people, you don't understand.
I see. This is not a problem that I've faced before, because as part of like a large organization, there's people in all sorts of funnel. There's people who are responsible for sourcing candidates and screening them, etc. So I am fortunately not responsible for this aspect, and I may actually also not be the best person to understand how this problem can be solved. But I think this could definitely be something of a discussion that you can take up within your organization with other people who also do this interview, right? And see if they have similar experiences in which maybe there's the question that can be changed, or the evaluation criteria that you've set for yourself. Those could get changed if that's not the case with all the other interviewers, for example.
Yeah, hope we answer your questions. And let's jump to another one. What if the interviewer is wrong? Is that okay to discuss this with the interviewer as a candidate?
Right. I think that it is. So there's, of course, going to have to be reasons for why that is the case. And there's a mixed answer for this, where you want to still be diplomatic about it. Like I said, if not being rude is a learning for interviewers, it would also be just in general a learning for just all people, I guess. So it depends on how, as candidates, we phrase it to the interviewer. We can tell them that we've had experience with this and this is what we think. And good interviewers should then accept that. But if they do not, I don't think the point of that exercise or of that interview is to showcase that you know more or less than the other person. So at the end of the day, I don't think it matters that much. You can express that this is what you think is accurate, and but there's no need to have a discussion on it, I think.
Cool. All right, let's jump to another two interesting questions. Yeah, first of all, have you ever come across a candidate that already familiar with the question you ask, and how would you navigate the interview in that case?
Fortunately or unfortunately, I have not. So that would be difficult for me to answer.
Does it mean like you indeed change your interview questions a lot?
There's all sorts of exercises, etc., that happen for question designing, but I think I may not, again, here be the best person to talk about that aspect of the interviewing process, etc.
Cool. All right, let's jump to another one. So you mentioned about helping candidates to succeed, right? And if there are some nervous candidates, do you have any tips on how to like help them overcome their nervous?
As interviewers?
Yeah, as interviewers.
Oh, yes, definitely. So you want to be able to make them at peace within the interview, because like I said, it's the responsibility lies with the interviewer. So there's things that people do all across, which is to begin with, say, a regular conversation and not just dive right in to a problem. I think that helps, similar to just how conversations go in general, where you have things like icebreakers, right? So there need not be an icebreaker in an interview, but you can still certainly start with, say, a 5-minute normal regular conversation about, say, how their day was, what they're up to, what they've been up to in their career so far. If they would like to describe that, you can explain your side of things, and you can really normalize the interaction so that it's not intimidating and does not make the candidate nervous.
Great answers. Yeah, any other questions? You can also raise your hand if you want. All right, let me wait 1 more minute. All right, let me ask you a quick question. Like, do you have any suggested resources for architectural interviews?
So there's going to be these different blogs, etc., that I have had in the past. I do not have immediate links for them that I can add somewhere at the moment, but that's one thing that I have used personally in the past to prepare. But like I said, they also lack in certain aspects, but they do give you some idea about how systems, say, that look different from the systems that you work on, how they look, and that can give you some idea. But at the end of the day, you do also want to get as much learning from what you've worked on. I see that missing from, like, I have personally had a hard time doing this too. And I don't think many people do this from my personal experience in my friend circle, etc., or talking to people about it, where there's a lot of things that we do in work, but we do not take those learnings out and remember them for such interviews later. Whereas, so this is what I've seen myself get better at the more I've worked in this area, where when I do things repeatedly, then I'm able to create some sort of theme out of the work and say, okay, so this is why this system is good, or this is why that is happening. But it's possible for me to take that learning away even while working on one of the projects. So I think there needs to be some dedicated time that you can extract such things out from your existing work also. And that's actually quite valuable too, because it showcases that So in presenting that thought, for instance, within an interview, you'd say something like, oh, I've worked on this in the past, and so this is. So that's an even better way of phrasing things, where you tell them that you have experience with that. You tell them a nuance of a solution that way. And it's, well, I find it impressive. I do not know if that's not the case in general, but that would be really nice. So.
Yeah, I totally agree on your point, because you mentioned that in the presentation as well, like if you only know how to design the system, but you never implemented it before, it's hard to go in depth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And there's going to be things that we miss all the time, if that is the level of depth that we have, where certain tweaks to the problem statement or certain changes to requirements should cause problems in the solutions that we've chosen, but then we'd not be able to think about them if we do not have in-depth knowledge. For example, exactly. The schema of a database could change. The way a cache is being used could change. But then we'd have to be using those caches or have worked on that database to find out such things.
Cool. And I think we don't have other questions from our audiences. So I think, yeah, thank you again for joining us and give us a great presentation. And yeah, thank you for joining WebHack Meetup as well. I guess that's it for today. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.